you all for having me and for the introductions. I'm very excited to be here. I'm excited to hear that there's lots of islanders among us. I too am an islander. I grew up on Gabriola Island, which is one of the southern Gulf Islands here. So sort of just northwest of the San Juans. Um, yeah, and I'm a data analyst with Birds Canada. Thanks so much again to Shannon for inviting me to speak here and for all of you to coming to watch. We've been excited to share the results of some of the collaborations we've been doing with our partners in the US, especially with folks in the US. So we're very glad to be able to do little events like this and outreach. Um, yeah, so today I'll be talking about a project that we undertook working with the Puget Sound Bird Observatory, looking to combine some of the data sets from north of the border with those south of the border, so that we could take a look at one of the many threats to coastal water birds and how we might apply these data to understand which species might be particularly vulnerable. So, first off, for those of you who don't know, our organization, Birds Canada, is a national level organization up here in Canada, which aims to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. We do that in a number of ways, organizing public engagement events, educational outreach, as well as administering long-term bird monitoring programs, which really are run by a huge team of volunteers. I'm in this room, I'm sure, are aware of how important volunteers are. They're certainly important to our operation. And the products of those we put together to conduct scientific research, make recommendations for conservation, all that sort of thing. As we know, conservation has to be international and a collaborative effort to really be a success because the birds don't really care about the border. Um, so we've been really excited to partner with the Puget Sound Seabird Survey, operated by the Puget Sound Bird Observatory, to further the conservation of coastal water birds. So, as we all know, marine birds in the Salish Sea face a variety of anthropogenic threats, ranging from chemical and oil pollution that can be big spills or just chronic exposure to oil in the water, human disturbance on the beach or on the water, changes in prey availability, the shoreline changing, habitat shifts, climate change, lots going on, as we know. And of course, all of these require attention from us and significant conservation effort to help mitigate some of the damage. Luckily, volunteers across the Salish Sea have taken up the task of watching out for these birds, giving us huge insights into the status of coastal water birds and how they're responding to changes in the region. Up here in Canada, Birds Canada has been conducting the British Columbia Coastal Waterbird Survey since 1999, and we were lucky to be joined by the Puget Sound Seabird Survey beginning in 2007, giving us a really full picture of the distribution of coastal waterbirds in the Salish Sea. These programs, they consist of shore-based counts conducted by volunteers who make multiple visits to a site every winter. So in the really cold, rainy months, they're out there documenting all of the birds that they see. And since the Puget Sound Seabird Survey and the British Columbia Coastal Waterbird Survey share such a similar methodology, we've been putting a lot of effort over the last couple of years into unifying these data sets to conduct some analyses that capture the entirety of the Salish Sea rather than just one side of the border or the other. One approach that we wanted to look at with these data sets was taking a look at vessel activity. Vessel activity, I'm sure we're all aware, is all over the place in the Salish Sea. There are big boats, little boats, you name it, it's out there. And these do have the potential to cause harm to birds. There's a lot of research out there showing lots of different ways that vessels can influence birds and can cause harm. The reason we wanted to take a look at this approach now is because tracking boats on the water can be difficult. And even once you've tracked them, the amounts of data can be overwhelming to work with. But luckily, recently, there's been a real increase in the availability of pre-processed AIS data. AIS is basically a system that uses satellites to track boats. And recently, some of the data that's come out has been maps essentially showing us hotspots of vessel activity, showing us the areas where boats are spending a lot of time versus areas where they're not really going so much. So with all of these impacts, the oil pollution, having to dive or fly away if a boat's approaching, um, all that can lead to mortality, reduced fitness in birds, and even abandonment of really highly trafficked areas. And as we know, there's going to be a lot more of large vessel traffic in the Salish Sea, especially up here north of the border with some of the industrial projects coming through. And so this is a really good one, a really important thing to keep our eye on. So with this vessel density data, that was now available, and these counts that were collected by volunteers, we wanted to see if we could estimate occupancy across the Salish Sea. Now, occupancy is a metric that describes the likelihood that a particular bird shows up at a particular location, a particular kind of bird, that is. Occupancy can be impacted by a lot of factors that birds use when choosing where to rest or where to forage, including things like human disturbance. The idea is that we can use these estimates to say if you go to a location with these conditions at this time, you have about a 50% chance of seeing this bird, or you're 20% less likely to find this bird at a busy, heavily trafficked area than one that's quieter. So we really wanted to calculate this occupancy metric for, it's actually 24 species. I haven't updated this slide, my apologies. We wanted to apply this occupancy metric to see where birds are showing up in the Salish Sea and see which groups of coastal water birds would be more or less likely to be exposed to the risks from vessel activity. How much overlap is there between where these birds are showing up and areas with really high vessel activity? So our first goal was to estimate nearshore occupancy and trends in nearshore occupancy across the entire Salish Sea, and then apply these estimates to explore the degree of risk that coastal water birds are exposed to from vessel activity in the nearshore environment. So how do we go about it? First, we took counts at above 300 sites across the Salish Sea from 2011 to 2022. We used these and some complex modeling procedures that I won't go into detail about to calculate occupancy and trends in that occupancy. Once we had these estimates in hand, we wanted to compare occupancy between areas of high vessel density and low vessel density, just to see how are species distributed relative to vessel activity. And we wanted to examine occupancy trends in areas of high vessel density. So are species maybe doing worse in these areas? Are they doing better in these areas? Could the additional pressures of vessel activity be making trends worse or maybe better for some species in those areas? Again, we were able to conduct this analysis for 24 coastal waterbird species in the region. And I'll just quickly run through what we looked at now. First, we had the region's three cormorants, the double-crested cormorant, the pelagic cormorant, and the Brandt's cormorant. Following that, we had the three loon species in the region, common loon, Pacific loon, and red-throated loon. We had the grebes, the western grebe, which of course has seen huge declines regionally. And we also had the horn grebe and red-necked grebe, quite common. You might have seen these while you're just out at the beach. And then this is the exciting part for this group. We looked at alcids as well, including the pigeon guillemot, but also including the rhinoceros auklet, common mirror, and the critically endangered marbled mirrelet. So we were really glad to get a look at that one in this analysis. And then we covered a bunch of different diving ducks, the long-tailed duck, harlequin duck, common merganser, hooded merganser, and red-breasted merganser, all three of the local merganser species. The bufflehead, common goldeneye, and Barrow's goldeneye, all three local scoters as well. That makes up our 24 species. So with all of the data in hand, with all of this analysis run, we took a look at our first goal. First, these estimates of basin-wide nearshore occupancy and trends in that occupancy. The exciting thing here is we were able to estimate occupancy and trend separately for BC and for Washington, as well as across the entire region. So we were able to do what we think is the first direct comparison of occupancy across the Salish Sea border. And although I did say that that the birds don't really care about the border, it seems like maybe they do, or they care about something that that correlates with the border. Most species that we looked at occupied significantly different proportions of sites across the border. And in most cases, species had higher occupancy in Washington, were more likely to occupy sites in Washington than they were sites in BC. We found among our 24 species, we had 12 species with greater occupancy in Washington than in BC, and 5 species with greater than 20% difference in likelihood to occupy these sites. Maybe this is due to generally greater primary productivity south of the border, leading to richer food chains. We didn't get into looking at exactly what is causing this. We just managed to identify this pattern. Maybe some of the restoration efforts going on in the Sound are really working out. But that was important for birds like the horned grebe. And again, excitingly, the pigeon guillemot. We found the pigeon guillemot occupied sites down in Washington a lot more frequently than they did in BC. Same for the rhinoceros auklet as well. And then the bufflehead and surf scoter. Those were the 5 with those huge differences in occupancy between Washington and BC. We did have a couple cases as well where BC occupancy was greater than Washington occupancy, 4 where that occurred, but only 2 of those differences were as large, greater than 20%. Those were the common merganser and black scoter. While we looked at the baseline occupancy there, we also looked at trends in that occupancy over the 11-year period that we examined. Again, we were able to do this for either side of the border. And while this wasn't the main goal of our project, it did allow us to identify 6 species that had significantly declined in their occupancy over that time, so it had become less likely to be found in our surveys, as well as 2 that saw increases. So there's good news and bad news, but we'll start with the bad news. Unfortunately, we did have the common loon declining at nearly 1% occupancy per year. Unsurprisingly, the western grebe declining. Again, this has been a species that has just had incredible declines over the last 50 years in the area, likely due to the redistribution of forage fish that it relies on. That's led to the designation as a special concern species here in Canada and also a species of conservation importance down in Washington. Additionally, the harlequin duck, another big decline in the area, and a pattern we're seeing emerge in a lot of our analyses that's kind of worrying is the long-tailed duck also having huge declines. This is, I think, a decline even steeper than that of the western grebe in this 10-year period. So this is definitely one we're keeping our eye on. We also had the Barrow's goldeneye. The interesting thing about being able to separate out those declines across the Salish Sea by splitting them into BC and Washington, so we could identify that this was one that appeared to be localized to Washington, with a nearly 2% decline happening there, while no real evidence of a trend in BC. And then finally, we had the white-winged scoter declining at about 1% a year. In terms of increases, we did see the common merganser increasing. Common mergansers, their populations can fluctuate pretty wildly based on climatic events like El Nino, that sort of thing. So that might have been causing that. And then we saw a very modest increase in the bufflehead. I included a little side note here specifically on guillemots, just to pull out all the information. And what we found, again, was much higher occupancy in Washington than in BC. About 50% of the sites that were surveyed down in Washington, so nearly 150 sites, they occupied about 50% of those sites versus about 30% down here or up here in BC. And we found that trends, thankfully, were stable for these species in BC, in Washington, and when looked at across the entire Salish Sea. Though some analyses that we're doing separately are showing some evidence of declines in abundance in the Salish Sea and especially in BC. So it's important that you're out there monitoring those colonies. We appreciate it. So with our first goal kind of hammered out, looking at that nearshore occupancy, we wanted to apply these estimates to explore how much risk these birds might be facing, how much vessel activity they're exposed to as they go about their day. And we looked at that more at the family level than at the individual species. So we looked separately at cormorants, loons, grebes, alcids, and diving ducks. For the cormorants, we found that these were common and increasing at high vessel density sites. The double-crested cormorant, for example, had about 10% higher occupancy among high vessel density sites than it did low vessel density sites. And species such as the Brandt's cormorant were increasing among high vessel density sites while stable elsewhere. So there's some localized population growth happening in these really high activity areas. And really, I suspect that this has to do with the infrastructure that pops up around high vessel density areas. Bridges, docks, pilings, all these things that cormorants like to have their nesting colonies on and have haulouts on. For example, up here in BC, the Second Narrows Bridge, just a couple minutes away from me, there's a huge and growing colony there that has been a local news story for a couple of years now. We do see this as a broader pattern as well. Colonies are generally shifting from natural substrates to man-made structures, which are associated with vessel activity, things like bridges. That also does mean the population is becoming more and more concentrated around these high oil spill risk areas, and are potentially facing more and more disturbance on the water, and directly on the nesting colony than they would in some of these quieter areas, the cliffs that they would naturally nest on. When we looked at loons, we also found they were common in high vessel density areas, but less so than elsewhere. The common loon, for instance, occupied about 20 to 25% less high vessel density sites than they did low vessel density sites. And for loons, we also saw localized declines at high vessel density sites. So for the common loon and red-throated loon, these declines popped up specifically among high vessel density sites while they looked stable elsewhere. So there's reason to believe that these sites could be contributing to some declines. We especially saw the common loon declining regionally, so it's important to note that some of these declines appear localized to these areas of high vessel activity. Loons are noted to be particularly sensitive to vessel approach, sometimes even leading to effective habitat loss. Studies have documented that loons might leave an otherwise suitable site if they're too frequently disturbed there by vessels. So we think that this will be an important thing to keep an eye on for loons in the region, to see if we can reverse some of those declines or understand them better at least. For grebes, we saw that they occupied low and high vessel density sites in about equal amounts. They didn't really appear to discriminate. But what we did note was that trends were slightly worse for the western grebe at these high vessel density sites. There's been a lot of study into the effects of vessel traffic on forage fish distributions. And since that's really the thing driving the decline of the western grebe regionally, it might be important to consider the effect vessels might be having in understanding what's driving that redistribution of the grebes. For alcids here, again, these we found more commonly occupied high vessel density sites, with some with some declines specifically in those high vessel density areas. The pigeon guillemot was one of those examples that seemed to have this sort of affinity for sites with high vessel activity. We found that they were found a lot more frequently there. But it does seem that they're not immune to the negative effects of vessel activity. Other alcid species, like the common murre, seem to have these declines, specifically in those high vessel density areas. And this isn't unexpected. Alcids, in general, have a really high energy cost of flight. It takes a lot for them to get off the water. Um, and that if there's frequent disturbance, that energy expenditure can really reduce their fitness and have some pretty significant effects. Oil spills are really a big concern for these species, especially the marbled murrelet, which has had parts of its population just wiped out by oil spills. So considering the high exposure that we found to vessel activity and their particular sensitivity, we think that vessel activity could pose a real threat to alcids in the region. We might not have time, but I added this little note here, just noting that we found that pigeon guillemot seemed to do pretty well in high vessel density areas, and we looked at this at a pretty zoomed out level, but it would be interesting to hear maybe afterwards why you suspect, if you have any idea as to why they might do well in these areas. Nothing obvious jumps out to me, but that you know the species better than I do, so I'd be curious if anyone has any ideas afterwards. But just quickly, I'll wrap up looking at the last family here. The diving ducks, this is a big family, so it's not surprising that we didn't really see a clear pattern in the response. What we did see was that regionally declining species like the long-tailed duck, the black scoter, that sort of thing, tended to have, or sorry, white-winged scoter, tended to have worse trends in high vessel density areas, maybe reflective of additional pressures being faced there. They are likely regularly exposed to vessel activity, and so it wouldn't be surprising if some of the additional pressures were influencing their trends. In sum, really what our study found, in all examined families, there's some degree of overlap with areas of high vessel density. Vessel activity is a likely contributor to some of the declines that we document here, and we've identified a couple cases where this risk might be particularly high. But really, the takeaway is that all of this is only possible due to international collaboration, and so I'm really excited to be here sharing these results with folks south of the border. So yeah, let's keep up the good work. Got some folks to thank, collaborators, the volunteers, obviously, the Puget Sound Bird Observatory, and all of the funders. And then if you're interested in more information, I have a couple citations here.
Thank you so much, Rory. I just find that really fascinating, and it really gets me thinking about our guillemots and how they overlap with your map of traffic. Does anyone have any questions for Rory? Or does anybody want to try to answer the question why the guillemots seem to be found in these high traffic areas or seem to be doing okay?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Lee. Oh, you're muted. You're muted. We can't hear you. There you go.
Thank you. You thanked us for documenting population counts, and you're welcome. It's our pleasure. Do you use our data at all?
I haven't used your data directly, no. Usually with Birds Canada stuff, we have to have something comparable in Canada, which sounds like you'll be talking about later. But in the future, I'd love to work with the data that you've collected. I've gotten to take a look around at it. Shannon's shown me sort of what you've all been putting together, and it's a really interesting data set. I'd be interested in getting a chance to look at it when we get something comparable up here.
Thank you. And then the only thing I can think of for this vessel traffic, and I can't speak for all of the surveyors here, but what we observe corroborates with what you say. These big vessels that go by and create giant wakes don't seem to faze the birds at all. Like, no, they pay no mind to this.
Wow.
So that is interesting. But I'm wondering if you have any correlation with eagles, and if eagles are affected by the vessel traffic, then they are the vessels are actually protecting the guillemots from.
Oh, that would be interesting. Yeah,
The eagles.
The sort of or predator deterrence by the vessels. That would be really interesting. I think that'd be cool. We haven't looked specifically at shipping traffic and how eagles relate to those areas, but that'd be interesting. That would be cool. I think there's something there.
Yeah, because the guillemots definitely notice the eagles.
Okay, got it. That's an interesting hypothesis. I like that. I have to look into that. Thank you.
I have a theory that the high vessel traffic, it's correlating with dense human populations as well, which comes also with structures. And the guillemots have really adapted to structures that are on the water. They love piers and ferry terminals. And they don't really seem to be bothered, or, I mean, we haven't measured this. These are just our observations. But in those areas, they're just determined to breed. So at least those ones that are used to it seem to do okay.
Yeah, I think that's been my closest observation as well. I used to work on boats out of the harbor in Victoria, south end of Vancouver Island. And I'd see guillemots popping out of little holes in the pilings and things like that. So my guess is that it's maybe something similar to the cormorants, where some of the structures that come with vessels might be facilitating them a little bit.
Brenda, did
you have just an observation, and that is, depending on the boat size, we have colonies in our state parks, which have mooring buoys for lease, seasonally. And those boats, like sailboats that, recreationists bring in, will oftentimes attract fish or shade the water so that there's more fish underneath, and the guillemots go underneath those boats. But those are not the vessels that you're talking about.
Yeah, our data would have looked at bigger vessels than that, but it might have the same effect,
Yeah, it might. One of our colonies, as I mentioned earlier, is on Hood Canal Bridge, which is a giant man-made structure, and we have probably just the west half of the bridge is where my team monitors. We have 150 guillemots involved in breeding on the bridge, and boats of all sizes come through there, but no container ships. It's all fishing boats, the Navy, things like that. The main disturbance that we see there, besides eagles, as Lee mentioned, is maintenance crews. And the guillemots will all fly away, like 50 birds will flush at one time. But the flushing is just momentary. I mean, they will come back in 20 seconds, 30 seconds. So I don't know what it is about
interesting.
but that bridge, I don't even know how long it's been used by the birds, but definitely they have a high tolerance for the sound of traffic above them, which is rare for a cliff nester. And then also they're all it's just like a bluff, there are lots of cavities, lots of availability for nesting locations, and they're not deterred.
No, that's interesting. You're convincing me more and more that it has something to do with the structures.
Yeah.
I think that's probably worth looking into.
Yeah.
I just have a thought.
Oh yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, it just is complementary to what's already been said, but when you think of the structures and predators, as Lee brought up with the eagles, not only may it be dependent on fewer eagles present there, although there may be more, but there's more subterfuge opportunity.
Right.
So that could contribute to their sense of safety, because as Lee mentioned, certainly eagles are the big scare, and you're just, you're a sitting duck out on the water, so to speak.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And the other thing, there may be more, maybe some of these buoys or pilings or anchors or wood structures provide habitat for forage fish.
Yeah.
Maybe. They might hang out there.
Kind of
So
like
there's more food.
it's kind of like what I believe it was Brenda said. Yeah.
I guess part of your study, Rory, was also assessing the risk to the birds. So they may be happy. They may be happy in these situations, and
it might be a trade-off.
And they're also exposed to a greater risk.
Yeah, exactly.
Posed by
really those acute events that I think would be really worrying for the alcids. From what I've heard, it sounds like the tolerance just for the regular activity of boats and things like that is quite high. But an oil spill hits one of those areas or something like that, and that could be a real devastating event.
Right. Definitely in the sound with all of the traffic we have going on, it's a real concern.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Let us know what you've been working on up there. So
we'll keep you in the loop. Yeah.
Thank you. And we will definitely keep in touch.
Yes, definitely. We'll be chatting more.
I'm looking forward to working with you some more.
Yeah, sounds good. All right.
All right. Well, take care.
Thanks for having me, everyone.
Thank you, Rory.
Thank you. Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.